genocide of Tutsis by Hutus. And it unfolded at an extraordinary speed with some 1 million people killed in about 100 days. The world was shocked, even as it failed to act. But there were warning signs, like the hate-filled radio broadcasts that incited violence, condemning Tutsis as less than human, and eventually urging listeners to commit unspeakable atrocities. The theater production Hate Radio takes us right into the broadcast booth of Rwanda's notorious radio station, RTLM. Now, it was first performed in 2011, and next month it comes to St. Anne's Warehouse in New York. And its playwright and director, Milo Rao, joins us from Stockholm. Welcome to the program, sir. Appreciate it.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
You know, it seems as if we're talking about something that would be innocuous. It is anything but. So when we talk about a radio program, for people who may not be familiar, what was RTLM and what is its place in Rwandan history?
And the history of RTLM is quite interesting because it was created after the opening of Rwanda itself, after the creation of democracy there, by the pledge of international community. So they wanted to create independent private radio station, and that was RTLM. So actually the idea was very well, but then it came under the influence of extremists. And that's how it was created. And it prepared the genocide. And during the genocide, it was even a tool to point on people where they were hiding, to even speed up the genocide. And of course, in the last days, it was bombed, and the different moderators and hosts were disappearing. Some were taken by international justice and live still today. So I could meet some of them.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of the stories were just hard to really envision in terms of how this ended up playing out in this genocide. Can you give some insight to our audiences as to why you decided to recreate these broadcasts in this play, in a theater, which some people, it would be called documentary theater, and some people are wondering why you felt this was the most powerful vehicle to do it in?
I think in that moment there was no television in Rwanda, and this was the first independent radio studio. So you can't evaluate the influence that it had on what actually happened. And it was also this radio that in a even funny way. So when you watch the show that we did, which just shows the radio studio, it's a lot of fun. It's very good music. It's a lot of different hosts. It's a lot of different stories. It was even a call-in radio studio. So it was very, very modern at that very moment for people that were not used to this. They were used to speeches of the president, to traditional music, to priests talking, and all of a sudden you had this kind of crazy boy group. They were casted. So where there was the funny guy from the city, then there was the lady talking to the more traditionalist people from the countryside, and so on. So everybody could identify with them. And they moved more and more, let's say, the barrier, what you could say in the open and public space and whatnot. So it started with little jokes, racist jokes, with sexist things, with little theories, putting paranoia on the listeners, and it went more and more. And in the end, it was really a kind of a station to kind of command the killings. So it was a very fast development. And I think you can really not overestimate the influence of this radio studio. Even I met a lot of people that were in the army that liberated Rwanda, so as soldiers, and even them, they listened to it because they loved the music, and of course they knew then what the other side was doing. And I think the specific thing we do in this show, we not only recreate a show, we recreate a show, and all the hosts in the studio that you see on stage are played by survivors of the genocide. So you could say that the victims are playing the perpetrators, telling them why they should commit genocide against themselves. So it's a very hard way of staging it and to understanding it the same way, because I had the impression I have to work together with the people that really listen to this.
Yeah, it would be.
This radio.
It would be quite jarring. Milo, I do want to give our audience just an idea of what you're talking about here. We're going to listen to an excerpt, and it's from a caller that calls in to thank RTLM Radio for what they do, and they then go on to request a song. Listen.
hari indirimbo ushaka gusaba? Ehe. Franchement niwe uduteza rubanda baragira ngo turi muri ambiance rwose kamere. But we need to move it
Move it.
You know, in testimony that I have seen in courts and extradition hearings for Rwanda, I heard a lot, obviously, of this call to genocide, which was presented as evidence, right? It was cold, hard evidence. I had not heard a lot of this. I had forgotten, and it is so jarring. How do you reconcile this kind of programming with the legacy of RTLM's genocidal language? It was incredibly harsh and dehumanizing for Tutsis.
Yeah, true. It's extremely harsh, and I think the hardest part of it, and you could hear it in this excerpt, that it is mixed with pop culture, with fun, with good mood. So when we imagine fascism and genocide, especially in Europe, we see, of course, these black and white pictures of Adolf Hitler and this kind of stuff. And then you have this radio studio when you present it, and we are touring since 15 years in all continents. Everybody thinks that it's from their city because it looks like a radio station from today. And that makes it extremely influential and extremely effective at that very moment. And you have speeches that are super direct, super political, and then you have this kind of joking about music and choosing the program. When we presented it the first time, it was in Rwanda, and we did it in front of the Rwandan Senate. And the wife of the director of the Senate, she survived the genocide, and she said that for the first time she listened to these songs again. For example, I like the movie Move It, because she didn't listen to them anymore because they were on that on that radio station. So it's this mix that makes it so effective and so horrific that as a public you even start to move with the music, you know, and you start laughing with the jokes, and then you fall immediately into the trap. And I think that's the interesting thing of the studio and why it was so effective.
Wow, that is a startling thing that you say, that what is essentially pop music would be associated with genocide in that way. And I do want to talk to you about the two words that stick out to me was the issue of the word cockroaches as it was used, but also the intimacy of the violence that actually was perpetrated. For many years, this radio station was referred to as Radio Machete, and the documentation of the horrific violence, neighbor on neighbor, and pulling it all back to this kind of dialogue on this radio station. How powerful was that for you in staging this?
It was extremely hard. It was extremely hard what to describe with cockroach, for example. So there is this whole process of dehumanization, legitimization, of course, of the enemy, but also of the genocide, creating the enemy, creating the Tutsi. They didn't exist as a group of people. They were a crazy mix of ethnical enemies and political enemies and so on. So it was really something happening in a slow way. It was just like jokers first, then it became more serious, and in the end it became very clearly, you have to kill them now, and we call you to kill now these people that are hiding in this school or that school or in this house and that house, even pointing numbers of cars and numbers of streets and so on and so on. So it was super explicit, and at the same time, as you say, super personal. You could call in, children called in, you know. They were talking to the victims before killing them through the radio. And all this together gives a mix that, for me, before I knew this radio was not, I didn't know about that. And of course, now I became very sensitive to hate speech. So when people are starting to talk like this, to make kind of a political program, a political speech like this, mixing fun and dehumanization and calling metaphorically for killing the enemy, but it's not meant like this, but perhaps it can become reality. So this is an extreme good example how a society can shift from democracy, from popular culture into something extremely dark.
And that context that you give us is so important. As you said, this was after Rwanda was had elections. I want to kind of give voice to the survivors here who talk about this, and just to quote one here, saying that I don't believe, I'm quoting a survivor here, I don't believe in an end to genocide. I don't think this is the last time we will experience these most heinous of atrocities. If there was one genocide, then there will be many more. It is grim, and yet it is likely steeped in reality, her testimony. And yet you, with this theater production, a very provocative one, how do you see it? How do you believe this will contribute to understanding the power of hate speech?
You understand the power of hate speech really by living its atmosphere. That's how this show functions. That's why I did it, by the way, because there are a lot of shows about genocide, but especially about the genocide in Rwanda. And there's a whole iconography of it, and there's a whole thing how you talk about it. But for example, there was never a way to really understand, to really being immersed in what it means to almost, as I said, dancing to the music and to understand that you can become subject of this kind of radio too. You can become perpetrator of a genocide too, without even trying to understand, because it goes slow. And I wanted to show that. I just wanted to give 2 hours, and there's a prologue in the epilogue, and you quoted from one testimonies, where we understand what is the outcome of it, what is the reality of all this fun, what is the reality of this hate. And I think it's kind of balance that the play tries to establish.
Certainly, the production now will be in New York, but given the first time you did it in 2011, it clearly has much resonance beyond Rwanda. Milo Ralph, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.